In a small town where most folks knew each other by name and Friday nights meant high school football under flickering stadium lights, there was a kid who didn't quite fit the usual mold. He wasn't on the team, didn't hang out at the diner after school, and you'd never catch him blasting music from a souped-up car. Instead, you'd find him tucked away in the corner of the public library, surrounded by thick books with titles like Constitutional Law for Beginners and landmark Supreme Court cases. To most people, he was just that quiet kid with the glasses. But to himself, he was someone who believed deeply that fairness wasn't just a nice idea. It was something worth fighting for. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't wear a cape or dream of fame. He just noticed things others ignored, like how the lunch line always moved slower for students who dressed differently, or how the school newspaper got shut down after publishing an article questioning the budget for new sports uniforms, while the science lab still used decade-old microscopes. Most kids shrugged it off. That's just how it is, they'd say. But he couldn't. To him, just how it is wasn't good enough, not when it felt wrong. Everything changed one rainy Tuesday in October. The school had quietly posted a new rule on the bulletin board near the main office. All student-led groups needed administrative approval to meet on campus, and any topic deemed potentially controversial would be denied. No explanation. No appeal process. Just a sheet of paper taped crookedly over last year's bake sale flyer. At first, no one paid much attention, until the environmental club got shut down. They'd been around for years, planting trees, organizing cleanups, even convincing the cafeteria to stop using plastic trays. But their latest project, collecting signatures for a petition about local air quality, was labeled political by the principal. Meetings were canceled. Posters were taken down. And just like that, a group of passionate students was silenced. That's when something clicked inside him. It wasn't anger exactly, more like a quiet, burning certainty. He'd read about the First Amendment. He knew students didn't lose their rights at the school gate. This wasn't just about trees or petitions. It was about whether young people had a voice at all. He tried talking to teachers. Most were sympathetic but nervous. "I agree with you," one said, glancing toward the principal's office. "But I can't risk my job over it." He reached out to local lawyers, hoping someone would take the case. Most didn't reply. The few who did said it was too small or not worth the hassle. One even laughed and said, "You're kidding, right? A high school club?" But instead of giving up, he dug deeper. Nights turned into research marathons. He studied court rulings, took notes in the margins of old notebooks, and practiced explaining legal ideas out loud in his bedroom mirror. He wasn't trying to sound like a lawyer. He just wanted to be clear, honest, and accurate. He found a case from another state where students had successfully challenged a similar ban. The key? Proving the school's actions weren't about safety or order. They were about silencing opinions they didn't like. Armed with facts and a growing sense of purpose, he wrote a formal letter to the school board. Polite, respectful, full of legal references. He asked for the rule to be revised and the club reinstated. The response came a week later, a one-sentence email. The decision stands. That's when he made a choice most adults wouldn't have dared to make. If no one would speak for them, he'd do it himself. He filed a petition with the local juvenile court, not for money, not for punishment, but for a simple declaration that the school's policy violated students' free speech rights. Technically, minors could represent themselves in certain civil matters, especially when it involved their own education. It was rare, almost unheard of, but it was possible. The day he walked into the courthouse to submit the paperwork, his hands were shaking. The clerk looked up, surprised to see a teenager without a parent or lawyer. "You sure about this?" she asked gently. He nodded, voice barely above a whisper but steady. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sure." News spread fast in a town that size. By lunchtime, kids were whispering in the hallways. Some called him brave. Others said he was crazy. A few even mocked him. Here comes the future judge. But he kept his head down and kept moving. What scared him most wasn't the laughter. It was the thought of doing nothing and watching more voices get shut down, one quiet cancellation at a time. At home, his family didn't fully understand the legal details, but they saw the fire in his eyes. His mom made extra sandwiches for his late-night study sessions. His younger siblings started asking questions about rights and rules. Even his dog seemed to sense something big was happening, curling up beside him during those long nights with the lamp glowing and papers spread across the floor. He knew the odds were against him. Judges didn't usually take teenage petitioners seriously. Schools had layers of protection. And the system? It wasn't built for kids like him, kids who asked too many questions and carried dog-eared copies of the Bill of Rights in their backpacks. But here's the thing he held on to. History isn't always made by powerful people in fancy suits. Sometimes it starts with one person, just one, who refuses to look away. Who stands up even when their knees are weak. Who speaks even when their voice cracks. He didn't know it yet, but his day in court would become more than just a hearing about a school club. It would become a moment that made people rethink who gets to be heard and who gets to decide. But all that was still ahead of him. For now, he was just a kid with a backpack, a binder full of notes, and a belief that fairness mattered more than fitting in. And sometimes that's enough to start a ripple that turns into a wave. The morning of the hearing, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of overcast that makes everything feel quieter than usual. He woke up before his alarm, heart already racing like it had been running laps all night. He'd rehearsed his opening statement 100 times, standing in front of the mirror, pacing the hallway, even whispering it to his dog. But now, with the courthouse just a few hours away, every word felt slippery, like it might vanish the moment he opened his mouth. He picked out his best clothes, a slightly too big blazer from a second-hand store, a clean white shirt, and the only pair of dress shoes he owned, polished until they almost shone. His backpack held his binder, organized with color-coded tabs, printed case summaries, and a printed copy of the First Amendment under a plastic sleeve, like a good luck charm. He didn't eat much breakfast. His stomach was too full of butterflies. The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined, but it felt enormous the moment he stepped inside. Wood-paneled walls, stiff chairs, and that hushed air that makes you want to tiptoe even when you're just sitting down. A few students from school had come to watch, sitting in the back row with nervous smiles. His mom was there too, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes full of quiet pride and worry. Then the judge entered. He was older, with silver hair combed neatly to the side and a deep voice that seemed to echo off the walls even when he spoke softly. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years. Known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for what he called drama or grandstanding. Rumor had it he'd once dismissed a case in under 5 minutes because the plaintiff kept repeating the same point. When it was time, the clerk called his name. He stood up, legs feeling like jelly, and walked to the front. His shoes squeaked slightly on the polished floor, a tiny sound that somehow felt deafening in the silence. He placed his binder on the small wooden lectern and looked up at the judge. "State your name and purpose, Mao," the judge said, already flipping through papers without looking up. He cleared his throat. "My name is, I'm here representing a group of students from Lincoln High. We're asking the court to review the school's policy that bans student-led groups from meeting if their topics are considered controversial. We believe it violates our First Amendment rights." The judge finally looked up. His expression wasn't angry, just tired, like he'd heard 1,000 similar claims and none of them ever held water. "You're representing yourself?" he asked, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." A pause. Then, almost under his breath, but loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Well, this should be interesting." A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone coughed. The judge gestured for him to begin. He took a breath and started. He spoke slowly at first, choosing each word carefully. He explained how the environmental club had never disrupted class, never caused fights, never done anything but hold quiet meetings during lunch. He cited the 1969 Supreme Court case Tinker v. Des Moines, where students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and the court ruled that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. But halfway through, his voice hitched. He mispronounced precedent as president and immediately flushed red. He tried to correct himself, but his tongue felt thick. His thoughts jumbled. That's when it happened. The judge let out a short, dry chuckle. Not mean exactly, but dismissive, like he was watching a kid try to fix a car engine with a spoon. "Son," he said, leaning back slightly, "this isn't debate club. If you're going to stand in a courtroom, you need to know what you're talking about." The room went still. A couple of people in the back exchanged glances. One of the school's attorneys smirked into his coffee cup. For a second, the boy just stood there, frozen. His face burned. All those nights of studying, all that hope, it felt like it was crumbling right there in front of everyone. He wanted to bolt, to mumble an apology and disappear into the hallway, but then he remembered something his grandfather once told him. When you're scared, don't stop. Just breathe and keep going. So he did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get dramatic. He just took another breath, straightened his shoulders, and said, I know it's not debate club, Your Honor, that's why I'm here. Because this isn't about winning an argument. It's about whether we're allowed to have one at all. Something shifted in the room. He went on, this time with more rhythm, more clarity. He explained how the school hadn't shown any actual disruption. No fights, no walkouts, not even a single complaint from a teacher. He pointed out that other clubs, like the chess team and the anime club, met without issue even though some parents had called anime inappropriate. So why was only the environmental group targeted? Because their topic made adults uncomfortable. He pulled out a printed photo. Students sitting in a circle during lunch, holding reusable water bottles, talking quietly. This, he said, holding it up, is what they call disruption. He didn't sound like a lawyer. He sounded like a kid who'd seen something unfair and couldn't unsee it. And slowly, the judge stopped scribbling notes. He leaned forward. His expression changed, not to approval, not yet, but to something closer to curiosity. Even the school's attorney stopped smirking. He glanced at his own notes, then back at the boy, like he was recalculating his strategy in real time. When the boy finished, there was a long silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes when people are actually thinking, really thinking about what they just heard. The judge didn't say much. Just a quiet thank you, and then turned to the school side to present their argument. But as they spoke, using big words and legal jargon that sounded rehearsed and distant, it was clear the energy in the room had already tilted. After the hearing, as he walked out into the overcast afternoon, his legs were still shaky, but not from fear this time. From something else. Hope, maybe. Or the strange, quiet thrill of knowing he'd said what needed to be said, even when it was hard. Back at school the next day, kids looked at him differently. Not like he was weird anymore, but like maybe being different was okay, maybe even powerful. He didn't know how the judge would rule. He didn't know if anything would really change. But one thing was certain, he hadn't backed down. And in that courtroom, under the weight of doubt and a judge's mocking laugh, he'd found his voice. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And sometimes, real is exactly what changes everything. The days after the hearing stretched long and quiet, like the world was holding its breath. He went back to school, back to his usual routine, sitting in the back of class, scribbling notes, eating lunch alone under the big oak tree near the bike racks. But everything felt different now. Kids who used to walk past without a word would nod at him in the hallway. A few even stopped to ask, hey, what happens next? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he'd said his piece, and now it was out of his hands. At home, the silence was heavier. His mom didn't ask many questions, but he could tell she was worried. Not about the case, about him. About the weight he was carrying. One night, she left a plate of warm cookies on his desk and just said, you did good no matter what they decide. He smiled, but didn't trust his voice enough to reply. Meanwhile, the judge wasn't rushing. Court records later showed he'd requested copies of every document the boy had cited. Tinkerville, Des Moines, the state education code, even old school board meeting minutes from the past 5 years. He'd also asked the clerk to pull similar cases from nearby counties. Most judges wouldn't bother. But something about that day, the kid's shaky voice turning steady, the photo of students just talking at lunch, had stuck with him. Then came the unexpected twist. A local reporter, who'd been covering school board meetings for years but never thought much about student rights, heard about the case from a teacher. Curious, she dug deeper. She interviewed students from the environmental club, checked the school's official records, and even filed a public records request for the emails between the principal and district officials about the ban. What she found surprised even her. In one email chain, the principal had written, we can't have them stirring up trouble with that air quality stuff. The mayor's office is already getting calls. Another message from a district administrator said, let's just shut it down quietly before it becomes a thing. There was no mention of safety, no evidence of disruption, just discomfort and fear of attention. The reporter published a short piece in the weekend edition, nothing flashy, just facts laid out plainly. But in a town where everyone read the local paper, it spread like wildfire. Parents started asking questions at PTA meetings. A retired teacher wrote a letter to the editor saying, "When did we decide kids shouldn't care about the world they'll inherit?" The school tried to downplay it. A spokesperson released a statement saying the policy was about maintaining order, but it rang hollow now that the emails were public. Even some teachers who'd stayed quiet before began speaking up in staff meetings, asking why student voices were being treated like threats. Back in his room, he watched it all unfold with a strange mix of awe and disbelief. He hadn't planned for any of this. He'd just wanted his friends to be able to meet and talk about clean air. Now it felt like the whole town was talking about what it meant to listen to young people. But the real turning point came a week after the hearing, on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He was in the library, rereading a case about student newspapers when his phone buzzed. It was a message from the court clerk. "Judge would like to review additional materials. Please submit any supporting evidence by 3 p.m. tomorrow." His heart jumped. This wasn't normal. Judges didn't usually ask for more info after a hearing, unless they were seriously considering the argument. He scrambled. He called the environmental club members and asked if anyone had recordings or notes from their meetings. One girl sent him a short video she'd taken on her phone during their last gathering. Just 30 seconds of students sitting in the cafeteria, passing around a petition, laughing softly about how one of them spilled smoothie on the clipboard. It wasn't dramatic. No speeches. No protests. Just ordinary kids doing something they believed in. He edited the clip down to 25 seconds. No music, no captions, just raw footage. He attached it to a one-page letter explaining that this was the disruption the school claimed was happening. Then he walked it to the courthouse himself, hand-delivering it before the deadline. The next morning, the judge watched that video, alone in his chambers with a cup of black coffee going cold beside him. He watched it twice. The first time, he frowned. The second time, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the window for a long while. Later, people would say that was the moment everything changed, because when the judge returned to the bench for a follow-up session, a rare move in such a small case, he didn't crack jokes. He didn't look bored. He asked sharp, thoughtful questions. He wanted to know how many students were in the club, whether they'd ever been warned before, if the school had offered any alternative spaces for them to meet. Each question peeled back another layer of the school's shaky reasoning. The school's attorney stumbled through answers, suddenly sounding less confident. At one point he said, "Students need guidance, not free rein to challenge authority." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is questioning authority the same as breaking rules?" Silence. That afternoon, as he walked home, the boy didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, but also lighter, like a knot in his chest had finally loosened. He hadn't won yet, but for the first time it felt possible. And then something small but powerful happened. A group of 7th graders started a kindness club and asked for meeting space. When the front office hesitated, one of them said, "Didn't the judge say we can talk about things that matter?" The staff blinked and approved it the same day. Word was spreading. Not through headlines or protests, but through quiet acts of courage inspired by one kid who refused to stay silent. He still didn't know how it would end. But he was starting to understand something important. Change doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a shaky voice in a courtroom, a grainy video of kids laughing over a clipboard, a judge pressing play one more time. And sometimes that's enough to tip the scales. The ruling came on a Tuesday morning, slipped quietly into the court docket between a traffic violation and a property dispute. No press conference, no dramatic gavel slam, just a 3-page decision typed in plain font, signed at the bottom by the same judge who'd once chuckled at a nervous kid mispronouncing precedent. But those 3 pages changed everything. He found out when his phone buzzed during 3rd period chemistry. A classmate had seen the court's online docket update and sent him a screenshot. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first line read, "The petition is granted." He had to read it 3 times before it sank in. The judge didn't just side with him. He dismantled the school's argument piece by piece. He wrote that the policy was vague, overbroad, and applied selectively, which made it unconstitutional. He pointed out there was no evidence of actual disruption, only discomfort with the subject matter. And then, in a line that would be quoted again and again, he wrote, "The First Amendment does not protect only popular speech. It exists precisely to protect speech that makes us uneasy. Most striking of all, he quoted the boy's own words about how this isn't about winning an argument. It's about whether we're allowed to have one at all." Seeing his own shaky sentence in official court language felt surreal, like watching a reflection of himself in a mirror he didn't know existed. By lunchtime, the news had spread through the school like a spark through dry grass. Students gathered near the lockers reading the ruling on phones, sharing it with wide eyes. Even teachers who'd stayed silent before were nodding in the hallways, some giving him a quiet thumbs up. The principal called an emergency staff meeting that afternoon. No one knew exactly what was said behind those closed doors, but by the end of the day, a new notice went up on the bulletin board. All previously suspended student groups are reinstated effective immediately. That evening, the local news ran a short segment. Not the flashy kind with dramatic music, but a calm, respectful report that included clips of the Environmental Club's video and a brief interview with the reporter who'd uncovered the emails. The headline wasn't sensational, it just said, "Local student wins free speech case in landmark ruling." Landmark felt like too big a word to him. He still couldn't believe it. He kept waiting for someone to say, "Wait, you're just a kid, you don't get to do this." But no one did. Instead, messages started pouring in. From students in other towns, from retired teachers, even from a law professor at a nearby university who wrote, "You've given us a real-world example we'll teach for years." Within a week, something unexpected happened. A school 2 counties over reached out. Their student journalism club had been shut down after publishing an article about mold in the gym. They'd read about the ruling and wanted to know, could this apply to us too? He didn't have all the answers, but he shared the court documents, the case citations, even his own notes. He told them what had worked and what hadn't. Soon, another school contacted him. Then another. By the end of the month, 3 separate student groups in 3 different districts had filed similar petitions, all citing his case as precedent. Legal aid organizations took notice. One offered free workshops for students on their rights. A nonprofit that supported youth advocacy invited him to speak, not as an expert, but as someone who'd lived it. He said yes, but only if he could keep it real. No fancy speeches, just honest talk about fear, doubt, and why showing up matters. Back home, things settled into a new normal. The Environmental Club met every Tuesday at lunch, now in the school's main conference room, ironically, the same room where the principal used to hold staff meetings about maintaining order. They started a recycling program that cut the school's waste by 40%. They even got the district to switch to eco-friendly cleaning supplies after presenting data they'd collected themselves. But the biggest change wasn't in policies or programs. It was in the air. Kids walked taller. They asked more questions. When the school tried to cancel a discussion on voting rights during Civics Week, 5 students stood up and said, "Actually, that's protected speech under the recent ruling." The event stayed on the schedule. He never asked for any of this. He never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted his friends to be able to talk about clean air without getting shut down. Yet here he was, watching ripples turn into waves. One afternoon, he found a letter in his mailbox. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on courthouse stationery. It read, "You taught me that wisdom doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears a backpack and speaks with a voice that shakes but doesn't quit. Thank you for reminding me why I became a judge." He read it over and over, then tucked it into the back of his binder, right behind the copy of the First Amendment. Months later, a state education conference included his case in a panel about student rights. A lawyer from the Attorney General's office mentioned it during a training for school administrators. If you're going to restrict student expression, you better have more than just "we don't like it" as your reason. It wasn't fame. It wasn't fortune. But it was impact, quiet, steady, and real. And through it all, he stayed the same kid who liked libraries, hated spotlight, and still got nervous speaking in front of crowds. But now, when he walked into a room, people didn't see just a nerdy boy. They saw proof that one person, no matter how young, how quiet, or how ordinary, can shift the ground beneath everyone's feet. Because sometimes, All it takes is one voice refusing to be silenced to remind the rest of us that we, too, have something worth saying. Years passed, as they always do. Quietly, steadily, like pages turning in a book you didn't realize you were halfway through. The courtroom drama faded into memory. The headlines grew old and life moved on. He didn't become a lawyer like some people expected. He didn't give TED Talks or start a nonprofit with his name on it. Instead, he chose a quieter path, studying public policy, working with community groups, helping ordinary people understand the systems that shape their lives. He still wore glasses, still preferred libraries to parties, still got nervous before speaking in front of crowds. But now when he spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, but because he'd earned the kind of respect that comes from doing something real. He never forgot that courtroom, though. Not the judge's chuckle, not the shaky breath before his first sentence, not the weight of silence after he finished speaking. Those moments stayed with him, not as scars, but as reminders that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when your hands won't stop shaking. Back in his hometown, the ripple never really stopped. The environmental club grew into a student-led sustainability council that worked with the city on clean energy projects. The school updated its student group policy, adding clear guidelines so no one could be shut down just because their topic made adults uncomfortable. Teachers began inviting students to co-design classroom rules. Even the principal years later admitted in a staff meeting, "We got it wrong, and someone young enough to be my grandkid showed us how to do better." But the real legacy wasn't in policies or meetings. It was in the way kids started seeing themselves, not as problems to be managed, but as people with ideas worth hearing. A few years after the ruling, a group of middle schoolers organized a mental health awareness week after one of their classmates struggled silently with anxiety. When the school hesitated, they didn't back down. They cited the same court decision, showed up with data and personal stories, and won approval within days. No lawyers, no drama, just kids who knew their rights and weren't afraid to use them. He heard about it through a friend of a friend, smiled to himself, didn't say much, but inside he felt that familiar warmth, the kind you get when you see something you helped plant finally bloom in someone else's hands. He never sought credit. In fact, he avoided it. When a documentary crew reached out wanting to feature his story, he politely declined. "It's not about me," he told them. "It's about the idea that fairness should be for everyone, even kids with backpacks and messy hair." They respected his choice, but the story kept spreading anyway, passed down in classrooms like a quiet legend. Remember that time a student stood up in court and changed everything? Oddly enough, the person most changed by it all might have been the judge. After retiring, he started volunteering with a youth civic engagement program. At a training session for teen advocates, someone asked him what made him take that case seriously. He paused, then said, "I almost didn't. I thought it was just another kid with big dreams and no experience." But then he kept going, even after I laughed. And that's when I realized, maybe the problem wasn't him. Maybe it was me. He and the judge never became close friends, but they exchanged letters now and then. Short ones. No grand declarations. Just notes about books, local news, or how the weather was treating them. The last one came on a crisp autumn morning, tucked inside a used copy of the Constitution Today. On the inside cover, in familiar handwriting, "Still learning. Still grateful." Life, of course, wasn't perfect after that. There were still schools that silenced students, still systems that favored comfort over truth, still moments when speaking up felt pointless. But something had shifted, not just in laws, but in belief. More kids knew they had rights. More teachers felt safe supporting them. More communities began asking, what if we actually listened to young people? He saw it in small ways. A high school in another state created a student voice committee with real input on school decisions. A state education board revised its handbook to include clear protections for student expression. Even national youth organizations began using his case as a teaching tool, not as a victory to celebrate, but as a starting point for deeper conversations about power, voice, and who gets to be heard. And through it all, he stayed grounded. He still lived in a modest apartment with mismatched furniture and a dog who loved stealing socks. He still made coffee too strong and forgot to eat lunch when he got absorbed in a project. He still believed deeply that change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from ordinary people choosing, again and again, to do what's right, even when it's hard. One spring afternoon, he visited his old high school to speak at a civics fair, not as a hero, not as a symbol, just as an alum who'd once sat in those same desks wondering if anyone would ever listen. As he walked down the hallway, he passed a bulletin board filled with student projects, a petition for better bus routes, a proposal for a mental health peer support group, a poster explaining voting rights for 16-year-olds in local elections. A teacher spotted him and smiled. "They've been asking about you," she said. "Not your name, just that student who went to court. They want to know, was it scary?" He thought for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It was terrifying. But you know what's scarier? Watching something unfair happen and doing nothing." Later, as he stood in front of a classroom full of curious faces, he didn't talk about courtrooms or rulings. He talked about doubt, about how he almost didn't go that day, how he wished someone else would step up, how he cried in the bathroom after the judge laughed, and how in the end, he realized that waiting for someone else to fix things means nothing ever changes. "You don't need to be perfect," he told them. "You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to care enough to try." Afterward, a quiet girl with glasses and a notebook full of sketches came up to him. She didn't say much, just handed him a folded piece of paper. On it, she'd drawn a simple image. A kid standing in a courtroom, small but steady, with words floating around like leaves. "I speak. Therefore I matter." He kept that drawing, taped it to his fridge, right next to grocery lists and reminder notes. A daily reminder that history isn't always made in grand halls or by famous names. Sometimes it starts with one person, just one, who refuses to stay silent. And in classrooms, courtrooms, and communities across the country, kids with backpacks and big ideas keep speaking up. Knowing someone like them once changed the rules, not because they were special, but because they dared to believe that fairness was worth fighting for, even if their voice shook.